Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back from the screaming, the flagellants, the mass graves, and the total collapse of everything, and instead, we're asking a very different kind of question. What was the Black Death like if you were obscenely, offensively, almost comically rich? Because while roughly a third of Europe was dissolving into history's most catastrophic mass casualty event, some people were doing fine, more than fine. Some of them were having a great time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a truly enormous thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and so does everyone in the comments, which is where I'd love for you to leave a note about where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Apparently it is always, without fail, somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning. The channel is also now on Spotify, so if you'd prefer to listen while you drift off, the link is in the description. Totally your call. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan if you have one, pull the blanket up to your chin, get comfortable enough that moving feels unreasonable. Let's think about this for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to be wealthy during the worst plague in human history? Did the rich just not get sick? Did they have better food, better air, better doctors, or just better excuses? Could you survive the 14th century if your house had actual floors? What did a medieval mansion smell like compared to a peasant hut? Did having a private physician help, or did it just mean someone was personally there to bleed you into a bowl and call it medicine? Could you buy your way out of God's wrath with enough gold? And did the nobility just sit around in their countryside estates, eating pheasant and pretending the apocalypse wasn't happening 20 miles away? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1347. You're wealthy, you have land, servants, and a fur-lined cloak that has never once touched a goat. Unfortunately, the Black Death has just arrived in Sicily, and it is making its way toward you with the energy of something that does not care about your net worth. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning. The moment the plague showed up and wealthy Europeans collectively decided it was probably someone else's problem. Word travelled slowly in the 14th century. No newspapers, no telegrams, just merchants with bad news and priests who looked increasingly nervous. The first reports coming out of Sicily in 1347 described ships docking at Messina with sailors who were already dying, covered in swellings the size of eggs, bleeding from places that skin is not supposed to bleed from. The harbour master reportedly ordered the ships back out to sea immediately, which was, medically speaking, several weeks too late. In the grand houses of Florence, Venice and Paris, wealthy merchants and nobles received these reports the way powerful people have always received inconvenient news, with skepticism, dismissal, and a quiet hope that the whole thing would sort itself out before it became their problem. It would not sort itself out. It was, in fact, about to become everyone's problem, including theirs. The first instinct of the wealthy, when rumours of the plague reached their ears, was not panic. It was something more familiar and considerably more dangerous, the belief that bad things happen to other kinds of people. There is something almost timeless about this reaction. You've seen its modern cousins. It's the person who hears about a hurricane forming 2 states away and decides to mow the lawn anyway. In 1347, it looked like wealthy Venetian merchants continuing to take shipments from the east, wealthy Genoese traders still crowding the docks, and wealthy Florentine bankers still hosting dinner parties for business associates who had recently arrived from places where, it would later emerge, a third of the population was dead. The plague was already inside the gates before most wealthy households had begun to take it seriously. And the reason it was inside the gates was partly their own doing, because trade was money and money was life, and stopping trade to wait and see what was happening in Sicily felt, in October of 1347, like an overreaction. It wasn't an overreaction. It was one of the most catastrophic underreactions in recorded history. But you have to understand the mental framework that made it possible. The wealthy of medieval Europe had seen plagues before. Epidemics came and went. You lost some people, you said some prayers, you buried the dead, and then spring arrived and things went back to normal. There was no precedent, not in living memory, not in written history, for what was about to happen. So when the news first arrived, the wealthy filtered it through the only template they had, which was, "This too shall pass. It shall not be as bad as the rumours suggest." The rumours are always worse than the reality, and besides, we're not the kind of people this happens to. Then the bodies started appearing in the streets of their own cities, and that template broke down very quickly. The speed was the thing that undid the denial. Cities that were normal in September were catastrophic by November. Florence, one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, lost somewhere between 45 and 60% of its population within months. The Bardi banking family, the Peruzzi banking family, institutions of almost unimaginable financial power, were shattered, their partners dead, their networks collapsed, their outstanding loans to the English crown suddenly uncollectible, because there was no one left to collect them. The plague did not care who you were. It did not care what you owned. It moved through denial the way it moved through everything else, quickly, indifferently, and without leaving much behind. By the time the wealthy understood what was happening, understanding it had become significantly less useful than running. Before we can understand how the rich survived the plague, we need to understand what being rich in the 14th century actually looked like, because it was not what you're imagining. There was no indoor plumbing, there was no central heating, there were no antibiotics, no refrigerators, no paved roads, and no concept of what a germ was. Wealthy in 1347 meant you had a stone house instead of a wooden one, meat more than twice a week, servants to carry your filth out before it accumulated too dramatically, and enough social capital that when you walked into a room people stopped talking and started agreeing with you. It meant you had a physician, not a good physician, by any modern standard, but a physician, which was already more than 90% of Europe could say. It meant your mattress was stuffed with wool or feathers instead of straw, your shoes had soles, and your dinner table had more than one course. It was not comfortable by our standards. But relative to the churning, parasite-riddled, perpetually starving mass of medieval Europe, it was extraordinary. Let's try to be specific, because the distance between medieval rich and medieval poor is almost impossible to overstate. A wealthy merchant's house in Florence might have multiple rooms, not just one room, actual multiple rooms, which was a luxury so significant it genuinely set you apart from the majority of the population. You might have glazed windows, which meant actual glass, which meant light without wind. You would have a proper kitchen separate from your sleeping quarters, a concept that had still not occurred to most of Europe. You would have furniture, real furniture, not a box you sat on and also slept on and also stored things in. You would have table linen, you would have dishes that were not made of bread. You would, in the mornings, have someone else empty the chamber pot. This last detail is not glamorous, but it is genuinely significant, because chamber pot management was a meaningful quality of life variable in a world where waste disposal was everyone's constant, immediate, intimate problem. But here is the thing about being wealthy in 1347 that tends to get lost when we romanticize the medieval period. It was still the medieval period. Wealthy people still had no germ theory, no understanding of contagion, no sewage systems in any modern sense, and no way of knowing which of their daily habits were killing them slowly and which were keeping them alive. A wealthy woman in Florence in 1347 was better off than a peasant woman in every measurable way, but she was still living in a world where childbirth was a serious gamble, where a toothache could kill you, and where the best medical advice available was genuinely indistinguishable, in terms of outcome, from doing nothing. And then the plague arrived, and the gap between wealthy and poor, real as it was, suddenly had to prove itself against something that was killing dukes. The Black Death did not respect the social order. It killed peasants and cardinals and kings' daughters and court physicians with an even-handedness that the medieval world found genuinely theologically troubling. What the wealthy had was not immunity. What they had was options. More options than anyone else, in a world where most people had none, and that, in the end, is what wealth has always meant, in the 14th century and every century since. The single most effective thing a wealthy person could do when plague arrived in their city was also the simplest: leave. This was the medieval equivalent of working from home, except the office was a rural estate, the commute was a 3-day ride on horseback, and your colleagues were replaced by frightened servants and maybe a hunting dog. The rich had somewhere to go. That was in itself a profound advantage that almost no one else had. A peasant was tied to the land, to the lord, to the village. A tradesperson had a shop, an apprentice, a livelihood that required physical presence. But a wealthy merchant or noble had an estate, often several, tucked away in the countryside, far from the crowded, stinking, flea-infested city streets where the plague moved fastest. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing his famous Decameron during the plague years, described exactly this. A group of wealthy Florentines retreating to a country villa outside the city, telling each other stories to pass the time, while the plague dismantled everything they had left behind. They were not wrong to leave. They were, in fact, among the few people in Europe doing something approximately correct. The mechanics of fleeing were not as simple as they sound, and the wealthy who did it successfully did so with the kind of logistical competence that tends to go unnoticed precisely because it worked. First, you had to go early. The estates that survived intact were the ones that sealed themselves before plague arrived in the surrounding area not after. This required accurate information, knowing that the plague was close enough to be dangerous but not so close that travel itself became a death sentence. Wealthy households had access to better information than anyone else. Merchants with trade networks, clergy with diocesan connections, political contacts who were receiving reports from multiple cities. They knew sooner, and knowing sooner meant leaving sooner, which meant arriving at the estate before the roads became clogged with desperate, possibly infected people, all trying to do the same thing at the same time. Second, you had to bring the right things. Provisions for months, not weeks, because you did not know how long you would need to stay sealed. Medicine, such as it was. Extra candles, because winter was coming. Musical instruments, books, and whatever else you needed to remain sane in a stone house for an indefinite period of time without going completely to pieces. Wealthy households sent servants ahead to prepare the estate days before the family followed, stocking the cellar, checking the well, ensuring the estate was ready to receive its inhabitants and then close its doors. This was a military-style logistical operation conducted by people who had the resources to conduct it. The poor had no such option. The middle class had the option, but often waited too long, attached to businesses and properties and social obligations that seemed essential, right up until the moment they became irrelevant. The countryside was not safe. Let's be clear about that. The plague found rural areas too, carried there by travellers, by infected animals, by the slow drift of the epidemic through every connected community in Europe. But it found them later, and in lower concentrations, and with more space between people, which slowed transmission in ways that no one in the 14th century understood but everyone could observe. Wealthy estates that made it through the first waves intact felt, and were not entirely wrong to feel, that something they had done had worked. They credited God, good air, aromatic herbs, and the quality of their physician's attention. The actual reason was distance, lower population density, fewer rats, and less shared air with dying strangers. But the effect was real, and the wealthy noted it, and the next time plague came, because plague came back repeatedly for the next 3 centuries, they ran again, faster and earlier. Every wealthy household worth its silverware had a personal physician, and during the Black Death that physician was very busy doing absolutely nothing effective. This is not entirely the physician's fault. Medieval medicine operated on the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and the belief that illness was caused by these fluids falling out of balance, sometimes due to bad air, sometimes due to sinful living, and occasionally due to the specific alignment of Saturn. The plague was not in their textbook. Physicians in 1347 were working with the intellectual tools of ancient Greece, several centuries of accumulated misunderstanding, and a profound commitment to bloodletting as the answer to most questions. What the rich did get from their private physicians, however, was constant attention. Someone was always watching, always monitoring, always ready to intervene with an herbal remedy, or a warm poultice, or a very serious recommendation to avoid strenuous activity. The care may have been medically inert, but it was personalised, which is more than the average plague victim got, which was nothing at all. A private physician in 14th century Europe was a status symbol before he was a health resource. Wealthy families retained them on annual contracts, a salary, essentially, for being available. The physician would be housed nearby, given access to the family's meals and sometimes their household, and expected to attend promptly whenever anyone sneezed in a way that sounded concerning. In ordinary times, this meant treating minor ailments, advising on diet and seasonal health practices, and attending childbirths. In plague times, it meant arriving at the bedside of someone covered in black swellings, pulling on whatever protective garments seemed appropriate and doing something. The something was usually bloodletting, draining blood from the patient through cuts or leeches on the theory that reducing the excess of whichever humour was responsible would rebalance the body. Sometimes it was herbal preparations. Theriac, a compound remedy believed to counter poison, was enormously popular and enormously useless. Sometimes it was lancing the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that gave the disease part of its name, which was, of all the interventions available, actually one of the more defensible ones, since draining an infected node occasionally bought a patient a few more days. None of it cured anyone. The Black Death had a mortality rate, untreated, of somewhere between 30 and 60% depending on the form of infection. The mortality rate with the best medical treatment available in 1347 was essentially the same. The physician was not saving anyone. What the physician was doing, however, was providing the wealthy with the most psychologically necessary service in a crisis, the feeling that something was being done. In a situation of total helplessness, having a professional present who was taking the problem seriously, who had a theory about what was happening and a plan for addressing it, who would sit with the sick person and monitor their progress, this mattered enormously to families who could afford it. It did not change the outcome in most cases, but it changed the experience of waiting for the outcome, which is not nothing, and in the 14th century was the best anyone could offer. The physicians who survived the Black Death, and many did not, emerged with enhanced reputations regardless of their actual success rates. They had been there. They had attended. In a time when abandoning the sick was so common, it became a defining feature of the era. Boccaccio wrote about it. Every chronicle noted it. Simply showing up was considered a form of heroism. The wealthy paid for that heroism. They paid very well. And the physicians who came out the other side discovered that their surviving wealthy clients were, if anything, more attached to them than before, and willing to pay even more for the continued comfort of their professional presence. One of the overlooked differences between wealthy plague survivors and everyone else was what they were putting in their bodies every day for their entire lives before the plague ever arrived. The rich ate better, not just occasionally better, systematically, reliably, across years and decades better. They had access to fresh meat, aged cheese, wine that hadn't been sitting in a barrel next to a decomposing rat, bread made from actual wheat flour rather than whatever grain had survived the last bad harvest mixed with sawdust and prayers. They had vegetables in season, fruit that hadn't fermented on the vine, and fish that was salted properly rather than just optimistically. This matters because nutrition affects immune function, and immune function affects survival. The wealthy weren't just richer. They were on average physically stronger, better fed, better housed, less exhausted by the grinding physical labour that wore medieval peasants into early graves before the plague ever had a chance to finish the job. They arrived at 1347 in better shape. That head start, while no guarantee, mattered. Let's talk about what a wealthy medieval table actually looked like, because it was not the lavish fantasy of Hollywood, not every night anyway, but it was genuinely different from what the poor were eating in ways that have measurable health consequences. A wealthy merchant household in Florence or a noble estate in France would have eaten meat regularly. Roasted poultry, pork, mutton and venison if they had hunting rights. They would have eaten fresh bread made from refined wheat flour, which was expensive enough that the poor rarely saw it. They would have had access to imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, not primarily for flavour, but as preservatives and, according to contemporary medical theory, as health-promoting substances that balanced the humours. They would have had wine daily, which was acidic enough to kill some of the bacteria that would have been present in water, and which was also considerably more pleasant than drinking from a well that shared drainage with the local slaughterhouse. The poor, by contrast, were eating pottage, a perpetual stew of whatever was available, primarily grains and root vegetables, thin on protein, often made from grain that had been stored too long, and had developed fungal contamination that caused its own range of health problems. They were drinking water that was frequently unsafe, eating bread that was frequently adulterated, and arriving at each winter nutritionally depleted in ways that compromised their body's ability to fight off infection. They were also exhausted in a way that the wealthy were not, physically worn down by agricultural labour, by cold, by the cumulative effects of years of marginal nutrition. Their immune systems were not operating at full capacity before the plague arrived. The plague found them already weakened. It found the wealthy less so. Not healthy by our standards. Nobody was healthy by our standards, but less depleted, and that difference, compounded over years, translated into marginally better outcomes during an epidemic that killed with terrifying efficiency regardless of who you were. The wealthy also ate better during the plague itself, which sounds obvious but has a specific implication worth noting. A wealthy household retreating to a country estate brought provisions. They ate through the crisis. A poor household in a city with a disrupted food supply, where markets had closed and delivery routes had broken down, might have been managing genuine hunger on top of plague exposure. Hunger suppresses immune function. It's not a complicated chain of causation. Better nutrition going in, better chance coming out. The wealthy did not survive because of their diet alone. But their diet was a brick in the wall, and the poor had no such brick. Here is a detail that sounds almost too simple to be significant. Wealthy people lived in stone houses, and stone houses are harder for rats to get into. The Black Death, spread primarily by the fleas that lived on black rats, moved through medieval Europe along the same routes as the rats, through wooden walls, thatched roofs, earthen floors, and the warm, dark, food-fragrant interiors of peasant homes. A well-built stone manor house, with its sealed floors, shuttered windows, and thick walls, created a physical barrier that, while not impenetrable, significantly reduced the rat and flea exposure of its inhabitants. Add to this the fact that wealthy estates often had more square footage per person, reducing the density that allowed disease to hop from host to host so efficiently in crowded hovels, and you have an architectural advantage that no physician could prescribe and no prayer could replicate. The rich didn't know why their houses were safer. They had no concept of germ theory, no understanding of vectors or transmission. They just knew that the countryside felt better than the city, and the city mansion felt better than the surrounding streets, and they were right, for reasons they wouldn't understand for another 500 years. The architecture of wealth in 14th century Europe was not designed with plague resistance in mind. It was designed to display status, to manage a large household efficiently, and to remain standing for several generations. But it happened to have properties that slowed transmission. Stone floors, for instance, were not hospitable to rat burrows in the way that earthen floors were. Rats needed soft earth to nest in, and a polished stone floor or even a rough-cut flagstone floor denied them that purchase. Stone walls had fewer gaps and crevices than timber frame constructions, fewer places for rats to gnaw through, fewer hidden passages between the warm interior and the cold exterior. This did not mean there were no rats in wealthy houses. Of course there were rats. This was the 14th century, and rats were everywhere, in every social stratum, in every city and town and country estate in Europe. But the rat density in a stone manor was meaningfully lower than in a timber frame peasant hut, and lower rat density meant lower flea density, and lower flea density meant lower plague exposure. Each link in the chain reduced the risk by a small percentage. Small percentages, compounded across a household, across a year, added up. The other architectural advantage was space. Wealthy households were not crowded in the way poor households were. A peasant family of 6 or 8 people might share a single room with their animals, sleeping together for warmth, sharing every surface and every breath. Disease of any kind moved through that environment almost without resistance. One sick person in a room of 8 sleeping bodies was almost a guarantee of transmission. A wealthy household, even during the plague, had the physical architecture to separate the sick from the healthy. You could put a sick servant in the servants' quarters. You could move a sick child to a room away from the healthy children. You could, if you were determined and had enough space, attempt something approaching what we would recognize as isolation of the infected. It didn't always work, but the option existed. The poor had no such option. In a one-room house, you either stayed and potentially died together, or you left the sick person alone entirely, which wealthy contemporaries noted with horror as one of the most devastating social consequences of the plague. Families abandoning their sick members because there was no physical alternative to total exposure. Medieval cities were also simply denser and filthier than the wealthy countryside estates they were surrounded by. Streets were narrow and shared walls with neighbours. Waste disposal was everyone's informal responsibility, and therefore no one's actual responsibility. Dead animals, human waste, kitchen scraps, and the accumulated detritus of thousands of people living in close proximity created conditions that were ideal for rat populations and therefore ideal for plague transmission. Wealthy city houses were still in those cities, still breathing that air, still sharing those streets, but they sat slightly back from the worst of it, with courtyards that provided buffer space, with staff who managed the immediate environment, with the ability to refuse visitors and control who came to the door. They were not separate from the city, but they were insulated from its worst conditions in ways that made their survival marginally more likely. In medicine, marginally more likely is sometimes all there is. The dominant medical theory about how the plague spread, and this is crucial, was that it travelled through miasma, which is the medieval word for bad air. The idea was that foul-smelling air produced by rotting matter, swamps, unburied bodies, or just general moral decay in the vicinity, carried disease into the body through the nose and mouth. This theory was wrong, but it accidentally produced one of the more interesting class distinctions of the plague years. The wealthy could afford to fix their air. Rich households burned aromatic herbs, rosemary, juniper, lavender, in their rooms constantly. They purchased expensive perfumes and pomanders, which were little balls of spices and aromatics held to the nose when venturing outside. Physicians treating plague patients wore the now iconic beaked masks stuffed with herbs and spices, believing the scent would filter out the bad air before it could infect them. The rich could afford constant fumigation, fresh herbs, and regular replacement of the aromatic stuffings in their living spaces. The poor could not. Again, the treatment was wrong, the rationale was wrong, but the side effect, keeping spaces smelling clean and discouraging rat-attracting rot and decay, may have helped anyway. The miasma theory was not a fringe belief or a peasant superstition. It was the official, university-endorsed, physician-approved understanding of how disease travelled, rooted in the work of ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, whose texts had been the foundation of European medical education for centuries. When the plague arrived, the medical establishment of Paris convened to determine its cause and concluded officially and solemnly that it had been triggered by a planetary conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in 1345, which had caused a corruption of the air that was now making people sick. This was the finding of the most prestigious medical institution in Europe. It was entirely wrong in every detail, but it was the framework through which every subsequent decision about plague management was made, and understanding it helps explain why the wealthy did what they did. If bad air caused plague, then good air prevented it. The wealthy could afford good air in ways that required real money. Aromatics, frankincense, myrrh, camphor, cloves, and the dried flowers and herbs that were burned in wealthy households during the plague years were imported luxury goods, expensive in ordinary times and scarcer during a crisis that had disrupted trade networks across Europe. A pomander, a perforated metal ball filled with ambergris, musk and spices, worn around the neck or held to the nose, cost more than a peasant family might spend on food in a month. The beak-nosed masks worn by plague physicians were stuffed with rose petals, lavender and camphor, aromatic materials that were not cheap and were not available to everyone. Wealthy households fumigated their rooms by burning aromatic wood and herbs, replaced rushes and floor coverings more frequently to prevent the smell of decay, and opened their gardens to fresh-scented herbs that were understood to counteract miasmatic contamination. None of this worked for the reasons anyone thought it did. The aromatic compounds were not filtering plague bacteria out of the air. They were not neutralizing miasma because miasma did not exist. But several of the practices associated with avoiding bad air had real, unintended benefits. Burning aromatic materials in closed rooms deterred rats and fleas, which found the strong scents inhospitable. Keeping living spaces clean and replacing floor coverings regularly reduced the rat-friendly organic matter in which fleas bred. Opening rooms to fresh air reduced the density of people in enclosed spaces. The wealthy were, in effect, accidentally implementing a rough version of pest control and basic sanitation under the impression that they were neutralizing corrupt atmospheric conditions. The mechanism was wrong, the outcome was partially right, and they paid handsomely for the privilege of being wrong in a way that happened occasionally to work. Here is the deeply awkward part of being wealthy during a pandemic. Your survival strategy required other people to take risks you were trying to avoid. Every country estate that successfully kept the plague out did so, because servants were still going into town to buy provisions, handle correspondence, and manage the estate's endless logistical needs. Every physician making house calls was travelling through infected streets to reach his wealthy patients. Every guard at the gate who turned away plague-stricken travellers was himself potentially exposed. The rich were insulated from the plague, partly because other people were not. This was not a new dynamic in the 14th century. Medieval society ran on exactly this logic at all times. But the plague made it visible and brutal in a way that was hard to look away from. Some wealthy households tried to solve the problem by sealing themselves in completely. bringing in enough provisions for months and simply not opening the doors. Others rotated servants in and out with various quarantine periods that they designed themselves, with no scientific basis but reasonable intuition. Many households lost servants to the plague. Some lost all of them, at which point the question of who was going to carry out the chamber pot became considerably more complicated. Medieval households ran on staff the way modern households run on electricity, invisibly, continuously, and in ways you only notice when it stops working. A large noble estate might employ dozens of people: stewards, cooks, stable hands, chambermaids, laundresses, gardeners, grooms, and a rotating cast of specialised tradespeople who came and went as needed. Each of these people was a connection point between the sealed, wealthy household and the infected outside world. The cook bought provisions from the market, the stable hand received deliveries at the gate, the laundress went to the well, the messenger travelled to the city. Every errand was a potential exposure, and every returning servant brought that exposure back inside the walls. The wealthy understood this, vaguely, even without the vocabulary to describe what was happening in medical terms. They could observe that plague seemed to follow contact, that households that received visitors got sick, that servants who went to market came back sometimes unwell. The pattern was visible even if the mechanism was not. The response varied by household and by desperation. Some wealthy families attempted to screen servants before allowing them back inside, looking for swellings, asking about symptoms, imposing waiting periods before re-entry. This was not systematic quarantine as we would understand it. It was a rough approximation based on the visible signs of sickness, and it missed the early stages of infection entirely. Other households tried to reduce the number of trips made outside the estate by buying provisions in bulk: entire cartloads of grain, barrels of salted meat, casks of wine that could sustain the household for weeks without requiring anyone to leave. This worked better when it was possible, but it required money, foresight, and the ability to receive large deliveries without those deliveries bringing plague with them. And then there were the servants who died. Wealthy households lost staff to the Black Death in significant numbers, and the loss was not merely logistical. Domestic staff in large households were often long-term employees, people who had worked for the family for years or decades, who knew the household's rhythms and preferences and secrets, who were embedded in the daily life of the estate in ways that made their absence genuinely disruptive. A cook who died had to be replaced by someone less skilled who needed training. A steward who died took institutional knowledge with him that could not be easily reconstructed. The wealthy grieved their servants, some of them, not always, not universally, but sometimes with something approaching personal loss rather than merely practical inconvenience. And then they hired replacements from the dwindling pool of surviving labour and kept going, because that was what you did, and because the alternative was managing the estate yourself, which was not something wealthy people in the 14th century were prepared to do. The city of Venice, wealthy, maritime, and acutely aware that ships were bringing the plague directly to its docks, did something in 1377 that would become one of the most significant public health innovations in history. It made arriving ships wait offshore for a period before passengers could disembark. The waiting period was eventually standardized at 40 days, quarantina, from the Italian word for 40, which is where we get the word quarantine. This was not purely altruistic. Venice was a trading city, and wealthy merchant interests were deeply invested in controlling the plague because the plague was catastrophic for business. The impulse behind quarantine was partly humanitarian and partly economic self-preservation, which in this case happened to be the same thing. Rich city-states had the administrative infrastructure to implement and enforce these measures in ways that scattered rural communities simply couldn't. The wealthy, in other words, had the organisational capacity to make rules that protected everyone, and for once those rules actually worked. The Venetian quarantine system did not spring fully formed from nowhere. It was an evolution of earlier, cruder attempts to manage the movement of potentially infected people. Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, had implemented a 30-day isolation period for arriving travellers as early as 1377, requiring them to wait outside the city in designated locations before being allowed in. Venice refined this into something more systematic. Dedicated isolation facilities called lazarettos, islands in the Venetian lagoon where arriving ships and their passengers waited out their quarantine period before being admitted to the city. The name came from the island of Santa Maria de Nazareth, where the first such facility was established in 1343, Nazareth contracted to Nazaretto, then Lazaretto, and the word stuck across European languages for centuries. These were not comfortable facilities. They were isolation wards, essentially. Places where people who might be sick were kept away from people who weren't, while everyone waited to see what happened. If you were healthy at the end of the waiting period, you were admitted. If you developed symptoms, you were treated there. If you died there, you were buried there. The wealthy merchants who drove Venetian policy were not acting purely from public health idealism when they developed this system. Trade was the oxygen of Venice, and plague disrupted trade in ways that were financially devastating. Ships that arrived with plague aboard couldn't unload their goods. Merchants who died of plague couldn't honour their contracts. Markets that closed during epidemic periods stopped generating the commerce that supported everyone from the merchant at the top to the dock worker at the bottom. A functional quarantine system that caught plague before it entered the city was, from the perspective of Venetian commercial interest and investment in business continuity, if your city didn't keep getting plague, your city's markets stayed open. It was exactly the kind of calculation that wealthy, commercially sophisticated city-states were positioned to make, and that feudal agrarian societies were not. The quarantine was a product of mercantile thinking applied to a public health problem, and it worked better than anything else tried in the 14th century. Other Italian city-states watched Venice and adapted their own versions of the system. Florence, Milan, Genoa, each developed their own institutions and protocols in the decades after the first waves of plague, shaped by the particular interests and administrative capacities of their governing classes. None of it was perfectly effective. Plague still got through, repeatedly, for the next several centuries, but the Lazaretto system reduced transmission measurably, and the principle it embodied, that isolating the potentially sick from the confirmed healthy could slow an epidemic, was correct, even if the people implementing it still didn't understand exactly why. If you were rich in the 14th century and you were frightened, and everyone was frightened, you had access to a form of spiritual reassurance that money could buy quite directly. Masses, prayers, indulgences, and the goodwill of the church, purchased through donation. Wealthy patrons funded chapels. They commissioned commemorative masses to be said for their souls daily. They paid priests to pray for their households. They made deathbed donations to monasteries in exchange for burial in consecrated ground and the prayers of the monks thereafter. None of this was theologically straightforward, and the church itself would spend the next century or two having a very difficult conversation about whether salvation was available for purchase, a conversation that would eventually contribute to the Reformation. But in 1347, in the middle of an apocalypse, the wealthy bought all the spiritual comfort the church could sell them, and the church, watching its own clergy die in enormous numbers and its own institutional legitimacy shaken, needed the income. It was a transaction that suited everyone in the short term and troubled everyone in the long term. The relationship between wealth and the church in medieval Europe was not merely financial, it was structural. Wealthy families had been funding church institutions for generations before the plague arrived. They funded cathedral construction, monastery endowments, hospital foundations, and the salaries of private chaplains who said Mass for the household's particular spiritual needs. In return, they received burial rites in prominent locations, inside churches rather than in the churchyard, with commemorative plaques and tomb sculptures that ensured their name and face would be visible to posterity. They received indulgences, formal remissions of the time their souls would spend in purgatory before reaching heaven, granted by the Pope in exchange for charitable donations. They received, in short, a kind of spiritual preferential treatment that money made possible, and that the church was willing to sell because building cathedrals required someone to pay for the stone. The plague complicated this arrangement in ways that were deeply unsettling to everyone involved. The clergy were dying. Parish priests, monks, nuns, bishops. They died at rates comparable to the general population because they were ministering to the sick and dying, and therefore more exposed than almost any other professional group. The very people who were supposed to provide last rites were themselves in need of last rites. Some wealthy households found that the priests they had been paying for years were suddenly unavailable, dead, fled, or so overwhelmed by demand that their private spiritual services had effectively collapsed. The church, scrambling to manage an institution that was losing clergy faster than it could replace them, issued emergency dispensations allowing abbreviated rites, allowing lay people to perform certain functions normally reserved for ordained clergy, and allowing a degree of flexibility that the pre-plague church would have found theologically unthinkable. The wealthy responded to all of this by spending more. Deathbed donations accelerated dramatically during the plague years. Wealthy individuals who felt death approaching signed over property, land and cash to monasteries and churches in exchange for prayers, masses, and the assurance of Christian burial. It was transactional religion conducted under extreme time pressure, and everyone involved knew it. But in a world where the difference between heaven and purgatory might come down to whether the right prayers had been said over your body, and whether plague could kill you between Tuesday morning and Wednesday night, having the resources to buy those prayers felt like the most important investment you could make. The rich paid for spiritual insurance, and the church sold it, and both parties understood that the transaction was imperfect. The theology was uncomfortable. The need was urgent. The money changed hands anyway. The experience of wealthy women during the Black Death was shaped by all the constraints that shaped their lives in ordinary times, plus the specific terror of the plague, plus the social expectation that they managed the household through the crisis without visibly panicking. Noblewomen and wealthy merchant wives were responsible for the domestic running of large households, the provisions, the staff, the children, the endless logistical management of a medieval estate, and the plague added a layer of genuine life-or-death decision-making to those responsibilities. Who came into the house? Were the provisions safe? Which servants should be let go and which retained? Was the well water clean? Should the children be moved to a different property? These were not small questions. They were survival questions, and they were, by default, handled primarily by the women who ran medieval households. Some chroniclers noted that women's letters from this period were among the most practical, unsentimental, and accurate accounts of what the plague actually looked like on the ground, precisely because they were writing to manage crises, not to theorize about causes. To understand what wealthy women were doing during the Black Death, you first have to understand what they were doing before it arrived, because the plague did not create their responsibilities so much as it turned the volume up on them, until everything else fell away. A wealthy merchant's wife or a noblewoman running an estate was, in ordinary times, managing a complex institution. She oversaw the kitchens, the stores, the linen, the hiring and supervision of domestic staff, the care of children, the maintenance of relationships with neighbouring households, and the hospitality operations that medieval social life depended on. She was, to use a modern frame that the 14th century would have found baffling, a chief operating officer who was also expected to be decorative and never appear to be in charge. The plague handed her a genuine emergency, and then continued to expect her to handle it without making a fuss. The specific decisions that fell to wealthy women during the crisis were consequential in ways that are still legible in the historical record. Which servants were allowed to leave the estate and which were kept inside? Who received at the gate and under what conditions? Which family members in the city should be invited to join the household in the country, and which could not be accommodated without dangerous overcrowding? These were judgment calls made under pressure, without reliable information, with everything at stake. Women who got these calls right kept their households alive. Women who got them wrong, who admitted an infected cousin out of familial obligation, who allowed a servant to return from the market without precaution, sometimes lost everyone. The margin for error was almost nothing, and the decisions were theirs to make. What is striking, reading the letters and accounts that survive from this period, is how often the women writing them simply got on with it. There is grief in the letters, real, specific, named grief for people who are gone, but there is not much space given to that grief before the practical questions resume. How are the stores holding? Has the priest been to administer last rites? Is there enough wood for winter? Did the steward send word about the northern property? This is not callousness. It is the operational reality of being responsible for other people's lives in a crisis where stopping meant dying. Wealthy women during the Black Death were not sheltered from the catastrophe by their wealth. They were placed, by their wealth, in positions of responsibility that required them to manage the catastrophe directly, on behalf of everyone who depended on them. They did so, largely, without the credit. Plague doctors were a specific professional category that emerged during the Black Death. Physicians hired by municipalities to treat plague victims regardless of their ability to pay. which meant they were also the doctors wealthy cities could point to as evidence that they were doing something. The wealthy, meanwhile, had their own private physicians who were not wandering through the worst affected neighbourhoods in beak masks. They were making house calls to the manor and leaving before dark. The gap between what a private physician did for a wealthy patient, close monitoring, personalised care, whatever treatments the era could offer, and what a plague doctor did for everyone else, a cursory examination, perhaps some lancing of the buboes, and a prayer, was substantial. It was also expensive. Wealthy households retained their physicians on annual salary-style contracts, ensuring availability and loyalty. The physician, for his part, was betting his life every time he visited an infected household, and his fee reflected that. These were not charitable arrangements. They were economic contracts struck between frightened people with money and slightly less frightened people with training that was almost entirely useless, but felt better than nothing. The municipal plague doctor, the one in the famous beaked mask, the long waxed coat, the leather gloves, was a civic invention born of emergency. Cities that had lost their regular physicians, either to plague or to the completely understandable decision to leave, hired replacement doctors under contract specifically to attend plague patients. These contracts were specific about the risks involved and compensated accordingly. In some cities, the municipal plague doctor was paid a salary that was extraordinary by the standards of the time, because ordinary standards did not apply to a job that required you to walk into rooms full of dying people every day without any reliable protection. Some of these doctors were qualified physicians, others were surgeons or barbers pressed into service because qualified physicians were in short supply. A few were almost certainly people who simply said they were physicians when the city was desperate enough not to check too carefully. The protective costume, the beak stuffed with aromatics, the waxed coat meant to prevent miasmatic contamination from touching the skin, the wide-brimmed hat, the cane used to examine patients without touching them directly, was a product of miasma theory applied to occupational hazard management. The physician believed the coat and the aromatics were protecting him from bad air. In reality, the heavy waxed fabric was making him a less hospitable environment for fleas, the cane was keeping him physically further from the most infectious individuals, and the overall ensemble, while not designed for germ protection, was accidentally functioning as a partial barrier. The plague doctors who survived the Black Death were not necessarily the ones with the best costumes. They were often the ones who examined patients quickly, touched them minimally, and left promptly, behaviours that reduced flea exposure in ways that had nothing to do with their understanding of why those behaviours helped. The wealthy patron's private physician operated under different incentives entirely. He was not serving anonymous patients in a public facility. He was serving one family whose continued goodwill and continued payments depended on his personal attention and visible concern. He was also, crucially, spending much less time in high-exposure environments than the municipal plague doctor who made dozens of house calls daily through the worst affected neighbourhoods. The private physician visited one household in a stone manor on the edge of the city and then went home. This difference in exposure volume mattered enormously. It is almost certainly one reason that wealthy households' private physicians survived at higher rates than municipal plague doctors, not because they were more skilled or better protected, but because they were spending less time with infected people. They were, in the most literal possible sense, working fewer hours in the danger zone. Their wealthy clients were inadvertently protecting their own doctors by employing them exclusively. One of the practical advantages of wealth during a prolonged crisis, and the Black Death, unlike a single storm or battle lasted years, was the ability to stockpile. Wealthy households had root cellars, salting rooms, smoke houses, and the financial resources to fill them before the crisis hit. They had access to preserved meats, dried legumes, salted fish, aged cheese, and barrels of wine and ale that could sustain a sealed household for months if necessary. A peasant family lived hand-to-mouth in ordinary times. A bad harvest or supply disruption of even a few weeks could mean starvation. A wealthy estate could, in theory, seal its doors and survive internally for an entire season. This made the practical decision to isolate, to simply stop engaging with the outside world and wait the plague out, feasible for the rich in a way it was not for anyone else. The wealthy could afford to do nothing, and in this particular crisis, doing nothing, staying still, staying inside, not going to market, not attending crowded church services was accidentally one of the better survival strategies available. Medieval food preservation was a science unto itself, and wealthy households practiced it at a scale that transformed their stores into something approaching a siege larder. Salt was the primary preservative, and wealthy households bought it in quantities that would have been unimaginable for ordinary families. Barrels of it used to cure meat and fish through the autumn before winter closed in. A well-salted side of pork stored correctly in a cool cellar could last through months without spoiling. Smoked meats and fish added another layer of preservation, the smoke's antibacterial properties extending the life of protein sources that would otherwise rot within days. Dried legumes, lentils, peas, beans, stored almost indefinitely and provided the caloric density to sustain large households through extended periods without resupply. Aged cheeses, properly waxed or stored in brine, lasted for months. Wine and ale kept longer than water and were consumed accordingly. The root cellar of a wealthy estate during the plague years was, in effect, a life insurance policy built from barrels and salt. Its contents represented the difference between a household that could seal itself against the world for an entire season and a household that had to send someone to the market every week, each trip a new opportunity for exposure. The wealthy understood this in practical terms even without the theoretical framework to explain it medically. You could see, observing your neighbours, that households that went out less seemed to fare better. You could observe that the crowded market was where people seemed to get sick. The conclusion, stay in, keep your stores up, minimise contact with the outside, was available to anyone who was watching carefully and had the resources to act on it. Most people did not have those resources. The wealthy did, and the ones who used them correctly bought themselves time. There was also a social dimension to the wealthy pantry that goes beyond individual survival. Wealthy estates during the plague years sometimes became informal refuge centres for extended family members who had fled the cities, for trusted servants whose own families had been wiped out, and occasionally for neighbours whose own supplies had run out. The ability to feed more people than your immediate household was itself a function of wealth that translated into social obligations the wealthy could choose to honour or refuse. Some opened their stores generously, sharing provisions with the surrounding village in ways that built lasting loyalty. Others sealed their gates and refused any contact with the outside, prioritising their own household survival over community solidarity. Both choices were made by wealthy people during the Black Death, and both were, in their different ways, understandable responses to an impossible situation. History records both, without always making clear which was more common. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the plague years and set among wealthy Florentines who have retreated to a country villa, is 100 stories told by 10 people over 10 days to pass the time while the world ends. This is a work of literature, yes, but it is also a document of what wealthy people actually did with themselves during the plague. They told stories, played music, ate well, flirted with each other, argued about philosophy, and pointedly tried to maintain the rituals of cultivated life in the face of mass death. It sounds callous. It probably was. It also worked as a psychological survival strategy in a way that nothing else available in 1347 really could. The plague was entirely beyond anyone's ability to control or understand. Maintaining structure, mealtimes, entertainments, conversation, the daily performance of normal aristocratic life gave wealthy households a sense of agency they didn't actually have. The alternative was sitting in a stone house thinking about all the ways they might die, which was both less pleasant and probably not better for the immune system. The Decameron's framing premise is almost too neat to be accidental. 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, gather in a garden outside a plague-stricken Florence and agree to entertain each other with stories for 10 days, 1 story per person per day, with a daily theme chosen by a rotating queen or king. They eat well, they walk in the gardens, they sing, they observe the social niceties of polite Florentine society with a precision that borders on parody, given that the city below them is in the process of collapsing entirely. Boccaccio is clearly doing something literary and deliberate with this framing. The contrast between the elegant villa and the charnel house below is not accidental, but he is also describing something real. This is what wealthy people did. They retreated, they gathered their kind around them, and they performed civilization at each other until the danger passed. Music was central to this performance. Every wealthy household of any pretension had musical instruments, lutes, harps, viels, small organs, and the ability to play them was a basic accomplishment expected of both men and women of the leisure class. During the plague years, music served a function that went beyond entertainment. It filled the silence that plague created, a silence that was itself deeply disturbing to people accustomed to the constant ambient noise of a functioning city or estate. When servants stopped singing in the kitchen because half of them were dead, when the church bells that had always marked the hours became associated primarily with the death toll, when the sounds of ordinary life were replaced by the sounds of crisis, music provided a counter-narrative. It said, "We are still here. We are still people. We have not been reduced to mere survival." It was a lie told in major keys, and it was necessary. The wealthy also read, debated, and argued their way through the plague years with a veracity that left a documentary record. Theological questions that the plague raised. Why had God permitted this? Was it punishment? And for whose sin? Was it the end of days? Occupied wealthy households for months. Private libraries, themselves a significant luxury, were raided for texts on medicine, theology, philosophy, and history. Wealthy patrons wrote letters to scholars and clergy asking for intellectual guidance about what the plague meant. They were not always looking for comfort. Sometimes they were looking for an argument, for something to push against, for the mental engagement that kept them from simply succumbing to despair. The wealthy entertained themselves through the plague not because they were callous, but because they were frightened, and entertainment was the most effective weapon they had against a fear that had no other outlet. Wealthy households that had retreated to the countryside still had businesses to manage, estates to oversee, debts to collect, and marriages to arrange, and all of this required correspondence. Letters travelled through the plague zones carried by messengers who were, by definition, moving through infected areas constantly and risking their lives to deliver news about grain prices and inheritance disputes. Some wealthy senders began rubbing their letters with vinegar or fumigating them with aromatic smoke before sending them, in the belief that this would neutralize whatever miasma had settled on the paper. This was not effective. But it was an early, fumbling gesture toward the idea that disease might travel through physical contact with contaminated objects, a concept that wouldn't be properly understood for centuries, but that some people were beginning to sense, intuitively and incorrectly, might be part of what was happening. The wealthy, because they were conducting more correspondence, and because they had more to lose, were among the first to start thinking practically about how disease might move, even if their thinking was entirely wrong. The volume of correspondence generated by wealthy households during the Black Death is one of the reasons we know as much as we do about the crisis. The wealthy wrote letters, and letters survived in ways that spoken words did not. Merchants wrote to business partners about disrupted trade routes, dwindling inventories, and the deaths of agents and factors who had managed key nodes in their commercial networks. Nobles wrote to relatives about the status of estates, the fate of tenants, and the logistical chaos of managing properties whose staff had been decimated. Physicians wrote to colleagues about the disease's symptoms and progression, attempting to build a shared clinical picture in the absence of any organizing medical institution capable of coordinating a response. And women wrote to their husbands away on business, to their children at other estates, to their mothers in different cities, the kind of practical, emotionally compressed letters that crisis produces, full of information and thin on sentiment, because sentiment was a luxury the situation could not afford. The messenger who carried these letters occupied an extraordinary position in the plague economy. He was, by profession, someone who moved through everything, through the plague zones, through the cordons that cities were attempting to establish, through the checkpoints that nervous gatekeepers were setting up on major roads. A reliable messenger was worth more during the Black Death than in ordinary times, and wealthy households paid accordingly. The messengers who survived, and many did, for reasons that probably had to do with their outdoor, mobile lifestyle, which kept them out of the enclosed, rat-dense environments where plague transmission was most intense, became essential infrastructure for the wealthy families who could afford to employ them. The practice of fumigating letters was widespread enough that it became essentially formalized among merchant communities. The Datini family records from Prato, Francesco Datini being one of the great merchant archivists of the late 14th century, show letters treated with vinegar, held over burning aromatic materials, and sealed with wax mixed with aromatic compounds before being dispatched. Whether any of this actually reduced transmission through paper is doubtful. The plague bacterium does not survive long on dry surfaces, and letters were probably not a significant transmission vector regardless. But the practice reflects something important about how wealthy people were beginning to think about the plague. They were beginning to treat it as something that travelled in material reality, rather than purely through corrupted air, not yet germ theory, not yet anything resembling the actual mechanism, but a shift toward the intuition that physical contact with things that had been near sick people might be worth avoiding. It was a small step in the right direction taken for entirely wrong reasons, and it would take another 5 centuries to become medicine. One of the darkest responses to the Black Death was the widespread persecution of Jewish communities across Europe, who were accused, falsely, fantastically, with no rational basis whatsoever, of causing the plague by poisoning wells. Massacres of Jewish communities occurred across the Holy Roman Empire and France as the plague spread. The wealthy and powerful played complex and often shameful roles in this history. Some rulers and nobles, motivated by a combination of financial interest, Jewish merchants were often creditors to noble families, and their deaths conveniently extinguished debts, old prejudice, and a need to give terrified populations someone to blame, did nothing to stop the violence and sometimes encouraged it. Others, including Pope Clement VI, issued explicit statements pointing out that Jewish communities were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else and that the accusations made no sense, not out of pure moral clarity necessarily, but partly because his own physicians had told him so, and partly because the Church's credibility was already strained enough without official endorsement of obvious mass murder. The well poisoning accusation was not spontaneous. It emerged from a specific social and psychological context. People who were dying in enormous numbers, who had no scientific explanation for why the dying was happening, and who had centuries of accumulated prejudice available as a template for blame. Jewish communities in medieval Europe were already subject to legal discrimination, residential restriction, and periodic violence long before the plague arrived. They lived in designated areas, were excluded from most professions and guilds, and were subject to special taxation and periodic expulsion at the pleasure of local rulers. When the plague came and people needed someone to blame, the existing architecture of prejudice provided a ready answer. The wealthy who presided over this architecture had built it, maintained it, and in many cases profited from it, and when the scapegoating began, their response revealed exactly where their interests lay. In some cities, the wealthy acted quickly and decisively to protect Jewish communities, not primarily because they believed the accusations were false, though some did, but because Jewish merchants and financiers were embedded in commercial networks that wealthy Christian merchants depended on. The destruction of a Jewish community meant the destruction of trading relationships, financial instruments, and credit arrangements that took years to build. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls in 1348, explicitly condemning the violence and offering formal protection to Jewish communities, a significant intervention, though one that the papal authority could not enforce in distant German towns where the mobs were already moving. The reasoning in the bulls was notably pragmatic alongside its moral arguments. Jewish people were dying of plague in their own communities, the documents pointed out, which made the poisoning theory incoherent on its face. In other cities, powerful figures made the opposite calculation. When a Jewish community was destroyed, its debts to Christian creditors were extinguished, and its property could be seized. Several German princes and cities that owed money to Jewish creditors found that the Black Death provided a convenient opportunity to discharge those obligations permanently. The wealth changed hands. The people who had held it were gone. The legal question of what happened to money you owed to someone you had just allowed to be murdered was, in the 14th century, not one that powerful people were in any rush to resolve. The Black Death did not create anti-Semitism in Europe. It revealed with terrible clarity the uses to which it could be put by people with sufficient power and insufficient conscience. Almost everything we know in rich detail about the Black Death in Italy comes from people who could write, which means almost everything we know in rich detail about the Black Death in Italy comes from wealthy people. Giovanni Boccaccio's account of Florence during the plague is extraordinarily vivid. The bodies in the streets, the collapse of social norms, the way neighbours stopped helping neighbours, the way family members abandoned family members, the way the rules of ordinary life simply fell away in the face of total catastrophe. What Boccaccio doesn't tell us, because he couldn't, is what any of this looked like from inside the experiences of the people who were dying in the streets while he was in the country villa writing about it. The wealthy left records, the poor left bones. This asymmetry shapes everything we think we know about the plague, not just what happened, but who mattered, whose suffering was named, whose survival strategy was considered worth documenting. The history of the Black Death is, in significant part, a history written by survivors who were already advantaged, describing a catastrophe that was, for everyone else, considerably worse. Boccaccio was 24 years old when the plague arrived in Florence in 1348. He lost his father to it. He watched his city transform, within months, from one of the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated places in Europe into something that he described with a precision that still feels visceral 7 centuries later. Bodies piled in the streets because there were not enough people to bury them. The smell of death becoming so constant it ceased to be noticed. Neighbours passing each other without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement implied a relationship, and relationships implied obligations that no one had the capacity to honour. He wrote all of this down. He processed it through the form of 100 stories told by 10 beautiful young people in a garden, which was its own kind of translation, turning catastrophe into literature, turning loss into narrative, finding a container for something that had no natural container. What Boccaccio could not do was walk through the streets he was describing and ask the people dying there what they were experiencing. He could observe them from a distance, from windows, from carriages, from the removed perspective of someone who had somewhere else to go. The poor of Florence in 1348 left almost no direct testimony. They left wills, occasionally, dictated in extremity to notaries who were barely keeping up with demand. They left entries in parish death registers, names sometimes, and dates, and occasionally a note about which household they belonged to. They left the bones that archaeologists have been excavating from mass graves around European cities for the past century, bones that tell us about the demographics of death but nothing about the experience of dying. They left absence, the absence of their voices, their perspectives, their accounts of what it felt like to watch everyone you knew die without any of the resources that the wealthy were deploying to survive. The wealthy witnesses wrote beautifully about suffering that was mostly not their own. They described their city's poor with genuine sympathy and something approaching horror, but always from the outside, always from the perspective of observers who had options the observed did not. This is not a criticism unique to Boccaccio or to the 14th century. It is the condition of all historical documentation from eras in which literacy was a class marker. But it is worth naming when we tell the story of how the wealthy survived the Black Death, that the story we are telling is partly a story about what survives, what gets written down, what gets preserved, what gets remembered, and that those things have always, in every era, been shaped by who had the time, the tools, and the safety to record them. The rural retreat worked, until it didn't. Some wealthy families who fled the cities to their country estates found that the plague had preceded them, carried there by travellers, merchants, or the servants they'd sent ahead to prepare the house. Some found it waiting in the village at the bottom of the estate road, already moving through the tenant farmers and labourers whose work kept the estate running. Some found that their careful isolation protocols failed when a sick servant collapsed in the kitchen, or when a messenger arrived from a family member in the city who needed help, and who turned out to also need urgent medical attention. The Black Death was not perfectly deterred by wealth, social position, or stone walls. Kings died. Bishops died. The Holy Roman Emperor lost his wife. The King of France lost his daughter. These were not people who lacked access to the best resources the 14th century could offer. Wealth raised the odds. It did not guarantee the outcome, and the families that survived with everyone intact often had no better explanation for their good fortune than the families that didn't. Just luck, timing, and the particular path the rats happened to take. The failure modes of the country estate strategy were specific and often predictable in retrospect. The most common was the infected servant. Someone sent ahead to prepare the house who was exposed in transit, arrived at the estate already incubating the disease, and introduced it to the household before anyone knew they were sick. The incubation period for bubonic plague is 2 to 8 days, which is long enough for a healthy-appearing servant to travel from the city, settle into the estate, and handle food and linens and common spaces before the swellings appeared. By the time the symptoms were visible, the household had already been exposed. There was no test, no way of knowing who might be incubating, and the behavioural signs that might warn you, excessive tiredness, a slight fever, unusual quietness, were easy to miss or dismiss in a person who had just made a several-day journey. The second failure mode was the extended family member. Wealthy families were socially obligated to each other in ways that proved lethal during the plague. When a cousin arrived at the estate gate, thin and frightened, having travelled from a city where the plague was raging, the social and moral calculus of whether to admit them was genuinely agonizing. The Church taught charity. Family loyalty was a foundational value, and the cousin standing at the gate might be perfectly healthy, carrying only the news of how bad things had become in the city and needing nothing more than a few weeks of shelter. Or the cousin might already be infected. You could not know. Some wealthy households developed protocols for refusing all arrivals, regardless of identity, a hardness that was practically rational and humanly devastating. Others admitted family members and paid for it. The estates that survived intact were often the ones whose owners had been willing to make decisions that, in any other context, would have been considered monstrous. What the plague's indifference to wealth ultimately revealed was something the medieval social order preferred not to examine too closely: that the protective structures wealthy people had built around themselves, the stone walls, the private physicians, the stocked cellars, the country estates, were probabilistic rather than absolute. They improved the odds in ways that were real and meaningful. But they did not create a separate category of person who was safe. The King of France's daughter, Joan of Navarre, died of plague in 1349, almost certainly while travelling to her own wedding. She had every resource the era could provide. She died anyway. Wealth was a buffer. The plague, when it decided to cross the buffer, crossed it anyway, and left behind the same grief in a stone manner that it left everywhere else. When wealthy people believed they were about to die of plague, and they had usually a matter of days between the appearance of the first symptoms and death, the question of what to do with everything they owned became extremely urgent. Wills were drawn up at extraordinary speed, often by notaries who were themselves barely managing to keep up with demand, and who were also frequently getting sick. The wealthy gave to the church, to monasteries, to hospitals, to the poor, partly out of genuine piety, partly out of the calculation that charitable giving might tip the divine scales in their favour, and partly because when you're dying in a stone house in 1347 and there is nothing your physician can do, and no one is coming to save you, giving your money away is at least something to do. Florence's charitable institutions received enormous plague bequests. Hospitals were funded. New churches were built after the crisis by wealthy survivors who had made promises to God and felt, unlike most promises made in extremity, that these particular ones should probably be honoured. The pace of will-making during the Black Death was so frenzied that civic authorities in several Italian cities issued emergency regulations governing the process. Under ordinary circumstances, a will was a deliberate, carefully prepared document that required witnesses, legal formality, and the involvement of a notary who could verify that the testator was of sound mind and not under duress. The plague collapsed all of this. People who woke up on Monday morning with swollen lymph nodes knew they might be dead by Saturday. The normal timeline for will preparation, weeks, sometimes months, was irrelevant. Emergency legislation in some cities allowed wills to be dictated verbally in front of witnesses without the full legal apparatus, and then recorded afterward by a notary if one could be found. Some notaries worked until they dropped. Literally, there are records of notaries who died mid-document, the will unfinished on the table in front of them. What the wealthy left behind in their wills reveals the particular mixture of fear, faith, and pragmatism that defined their relationship to impending death. The religious bequests were enormous, far larger, proportionally, than wills drawn up in ordinary times. Land given to monasteries for perpetual prayer, money for hospitals that would bear the family name, funds for chapels to be decorated with specific images, paid for specific masses to be said on specific anniversaries, arranged to ensure that the testator's soul would be prayed for continuously, long after the body was in the ground. These were investments in the afterlife made by people who had reason to believe the afterlife was imminent, and they were made with the same commercial precision that these people brought to their business affairs in ordinary times. The Church received gifts that transformed its institutional landscape in the decades after the Black Death: new hospitals, new chapels, new endowments, funded by the terrified generosity of wealthy plague deaths. The bequests to the poor were also significant and not entirely cynical. Medieval theology was explicit that care for the poor was a spiritual obligation, that giving to those in need was among the most direct ways of accumulating the divine credit that might, at the moment of judgment, tip the scales toward mercy. Wealthy plague testators left money for bread to be distributed at their funerals, for dowries for poor girls who could not otherwise marry, for the ransoming of debtors from prison. Some of these bequests were purely transactional. Buy enough goodwill from God through the poor, and maybe God will overlook some of the other things on the ledger. Others were genuinely motivated by the particular clarity that comes from facing death, when the difference between what matters and what doesn't becomes briefly, painfully obvious. The wealthy dying of plague gave their money away with an urgency that their healthy selves had never managed. Whether that urgency was wisdom or panic is a question the 14th century did not pause to answer. Here is the paradox at the centre of the Black Death's relationship to wealth. The plague was catastrophic for the wealthy as individuals, but transformative for the institution of wealth more broadly. When a third of Europe's population died, enormous amounts of land, property and capital had to go somewhere. Estates passed to distant relatives who hadn't expected to inherit anything. Small families suddenly owned vast properties. Craftspeople and skilled labourers, suddenly scarce, could demand wages that would have been inconceivable before the plague. The feudal economic model, which depended on an abundant supply of people willing to work land for subsistence wages because they had no alternative, cracked under the pressure of labour scarcity. In some regions, this was the beginning of the end for serfdom, not out of any moral evolution, but because the surviving peasants suddenly had leverage. The wealthy who survived the plague often found themselves richer than they'd been before, heirs to the consolidated estates of families that had been wiped out entirely. History's cruelest lottery. The mechanics of plague inheritance were staggering in their complexity and, in many cases, their sheer absurdity. When a wealthy family died in rapid succession, father, then mother, then eldest son, then second son, all within weeks, the question of who inherited what became a legal puzzle of considerable difficulty. Medieval inheritance law was built on the assumption that family members would die in a predictable order, with time between deaths for the legal apparatus to process each one. The plague did not respect this assumption. Sometimes entire family lines were extinguished so quickly that there was no surviving heir closer than a third cousin, who hadn't known the family existed. Sometimes two branches of a family were simultaneously claiming the same estate, because the deaths had happened in an order that made both claims legally defensible. Lawyers, in the cities that still had lawyers, were as busy as the notaries. The legal system, stripped of a third of its practitioners, was managing a caseload that was simultaneously enormous and staffed by people who were themselves dying. What emerged from this chaos slowly and unevenly over the decades after the Black Death was a restructuring of wealth distribution that had profound long-term consequences. Surviving heirs consolidated properties. Wealthy families that had been rivals or equals before the plague found themselves, after it, in very different positions, one family intact, the other represented by a single surviving child who had inherited everything from 3 different lines of relatives. The land did not disappear when its owners died. It accumulated in fewer hands. The people who survived and managed their affairs well in the aftermath found themselves in possession of resources that the pre-plague world had spread across many more people. This was not comfort for the grief of loss, but it was the economic reality that the survivors navigated, and it shaped the structure of European wealth for generations afterward in ways that are still, if you look carefully, visible in the institutional landscape of the modern world. Wealthy people in the 14th century were cleaner than their peasant contemporaries, but the bar for this comparison is low enough that cleaner should be used with significant caution. The wealthy bathed more regularly, perhaps monthly rather than seasonally, in wooden tubs filled with heated water, sometimes scented with herbs or rose petals. They wore finer linen undergarments that were changed more frequently than the wool outer layers, which were essentially never washed. They had access to soap, which was imported and expensive. They had chamber pots that were emptied by servants, rather than simply using the nearest corner or the street, and in better residences those chamber pots emptied into external cesspits rather than the immediate vicinity. None of this was what you'd call sanitary by any modern measure, but relative to the conditions in which most medieval people lived, the baseline cleanliness of a wealthy household reduced, marginally, meaninglessly, by germ theory standards but not entirely by practical standards, the density of the filth, flea population, and accumulated organic matter through which plague moved most efficiently. They were still medieval, they were just slightly less medieval. Let's be honest about what a monthly bath actually meant in the 14th century, because the image it conjures, a warm, pleasant, rose-scented soak in a copper tub, is not entirely wrong but is missing some crucial context. The tub was wooden. The water was heated over a fire, carried bucket by servants, and by the time it reached the bather it was already cooling. The bath was taken in the same room as the fire, which meant the same room as the smoke, so you were simultaneously washing and inhaling the particular combination of burning wood and whatever aromatic herbs someone had thrown onto the coals to make the experience feel more like luxury and less like an ordeal. If you were lucky, you had the tub to yourself. In some households, family members bathed in sequence in the same water, oldest to youngest, which is exactly as charming as it sounds. And when it was over, the tub was emptied somewhere, somehow by someone who was not you. That last detail was genuinely a meaningful quality of life variable. Soap was available to the wealthy, but was not the transparent, fragrant, individually wrapped product of your imagination. Medieval soap was made from animal fat and wood ash, was dark, soft and strongly alkaline, and smelled primarily of its raw materials. It worked. It was genuinely effective at breaking down grease and dirt, but using it was not a sensory pleasure so much as a functional act. Wealthy households bought it in bulk from soap merchants, and used it for laundry as well as personal washing, which meant it was rationed in ways that made the modern equivalent of using a fresh bar every few days essentially unthinkable. Hair was washed infrequently, combed with fine-toothed combs designed specifically to remove lice. A tool so universal across all social classes that its presence in a household tells you nothing about wealth and everything about the universal medieval relationship with parasitic insects. The connection between any of this and plague survival is indirect but real. Fleas, the primary vector of bubonic plague, prefer warm, organic environments. A body that is bathed occasionally and whose living spaces are cleaned with some regularity is a marginally less hospitable flea environment than one that is never cleaned at all. The difference is not absolute. Fleas are flexible. But the density of the flea population in a wealthy household where the floor was swept, the linens changed, and the residents bathed with some regularity was lower than in a crowded peasant dwelling, where none of these things happened at all. The wealthy were not clean by our standards. They were clean enough relative to the baseline that the mathematics of flea exposure worked slightly in their favour. In a disease that killed between 30 and 60% of those it infected, slightly was worth something. When the first wave of the Black Death finally passed, and it passed slowly, receding over years rather than weeks, the wealthy survivors emerged from their estates and returned to cities that had been transformed almost beyond recognition. Familiar houses stood empty, business partners were dead, trade networks had collapsed, entire streets that had been prosperous neighbourhoods were now abandoned, and yet life, with the particular stubbornness of life, resumed. The wealthy rebuilt. They commissioned art, an enormous amount of art, much of it preoccupied with death and resurrection, in ways that pre-plague art had not been. They patronised hospitals and churches. They renegotiated commercial relationships, wrote new contracts, hired new staff from the depleted labour pool, and paid more for everything than they had before. They married again, quickly, because lineage and inheritance didn't pause for grief. They adapted, as they always had, with the particular efficiency of people who had the resources to adapt, and the social position to make adaptation look like leadership. The cities were smaller, quieter and strange, but the wealthy were still in them, still in charge, still managing the machinery of power, which had taken damage but not collapsed entirely. Returning to a post-plague city was an experience that no one who did it ever fully described, which is itself telling. The chroniclers who had written so vividly about the plague's arrival and progression went quieter when it came to the aftermath. Perhaps the after was harder to write about because it lacked the dramatic structure of crisis. No arrival, no peak, no clear resolution, just a slow, uncertain normalization of conditions that were still profoundly abnormal. The city you came back to looked like the city you had left. The streets were the same streets. The buildings were mostly standing. But the people were different, fewer, and the ones who remained wore something in their faces that was not there before, a kind of permanent recalibration of what could be expected from a day, from a year, from a life. The wealthy approached this recalibration with their characteristic toolkit: money, organisation, and social connection. Where a poor family returning to a city after the plague found an empty house and no resources to rebuild, a wealthy merchant family found an empty city full of opportunities. Properties could be acquired cheaply from estates whose owners had died without heirs. Labour, scarce everywhere, could still be attracted by those who could pay above the going rate. Trade networks, disrupted everywhere simultaneously, could be rebuilt by those with the capital to extend credit, absorb losses, and wait for conditions to normalise. The wealthy had lost people and property and money to the plague, but they still had more than almost everyone else, and in the economy of scarcity that the plague created, more than almost everyone else was a powerful position from which to rebuild. The remarriage patterns of wealthy plague survivors are among the more striking demographic features of the post-plague record. Wealthy widowers remarried within months, sometimes weeks, of their wives' deaths. Wealthy widows remarried almost as quickly, either by choice or by pressure from families who recognized that a woman controlling a large estate alone was a situation medieval law was not designed to accommodate indefinitely. These remarriages were not primarily romantic. They were strategic, consolidations of property, alliances between surviving families, attempts to produce heirs who could inherit the accumulated wealth before another plague wave arrived to scramble the inheritance again. The plague had demonstrated that life was short and uncertain, and that the legal and biological processes by which wealth passed between generations required living people to function. The surviving wealthy produced those living people with an urgency that made the post-plague period, demographically, one of the most frenetic in medieval European history. Grief was real. So was arithmetic, and in the 14th century, arithmetic usually won. The most haunting thing about the wealthy survivors of the Black Death is not what they did differently, but what they couldn't explain. They had done everything right by their era's standards. They had fled to the country. They had burned herbs. They had paid physicians. They had prayed, donated, confessed, and abstained from the crowded public spaces that seemed to breed contagion. And some of them died anyway, and some of their neighbours who did none of these things survived. The plague's apparent randomness was philosophically destabilizing in a way that went beyond grief. Medieval theology offered a framework, God's will, punishment for sin, the mystery of divine providence. But even the most devout survivors struggled to explain why their children had died while their sinful neighbours' children lived. Wealthy survivors wrote about this confusion. They funded theological debates about it. They commissioned paintings depicting the skeleton of death, harvesting the rich alongside the poor with apparent impartiality. They could not make sense of it, and neither, centuries later, can we. Except now we know it was fleas. There is a particular kind of survivor's disorientation that sets in when the crisis is over, and the accounting begins, when you sit down, finally, with the quiet and the safety you craved all those months, and realize that you cannot identify why you are alive. The wealthy survivors of the Black Death sat with this disorientation in some of the finest houses in Europe, surrounded by the best things money could buy, and found that none of it answered the question. Why them? Why not the others? The business partner who had been equally careful, equally well-resourced, equally faithful, who had done everything they had done and died anyway in September. The neighbour who had done nothing right, who had stayed in the city through the worst of it, who had drunk from questionable water and attended crowded masses and somehow walked out the other side intact. The randomness was not incidental to the experience of surviving the Black Death. It was central. It was the thing you could not stop thinking about. Wealthy survivors responded to this disorientation in ways that are legible in the cultural record they left behind. Some became more religious, more ostentatiously devout, as though surviving had incurred a debt to God that required conspicuous repayment. They built chapels, endowed masses, commissioned devotional art on a scale that transformed the visual landscape of European Christianity in the decades after the first plague wave. Some became, conversely, less religious, quietly, privately less trusting of a theology that had promised divine order and delivered spectacular chaos. The plague's apparent indifference to virtue, to wealth, to the careful observation of religious obligation undermined the sense that the universe operated on comprehensible principles, and some survivors never quite got that sense back. They performed their religious duties. They attended Mass. But the private conviction that it all meant something, that the prayers were heard and the observances mattered, had been knocked loose and did not always settle back into place. Some wealthy survivors simply worked. They threw themselves into rebuilding their businesses, managing their estates, planning their children's marriages, and operating within the structures of commercial and social life with a focus that might have looked, from the outside, like resilience. From the inside, it looked more like a deliberate refusal to stop moving, because stopping meant sitting quietly with questions that had no answers. The wealthy survivors who rebuilt most effectively were often the ones best at directing their energy outward, toward action, toward reconstruction, toward the future, rather than inward toward the unanswerable past. Whether this was wisdom or avoidance, the 14th century could not say, and neither can we. But it worked, in the narrow sense that the work got done, and the cities came back and life resumed. And the questions remained, tucked into the corners of prosperous estates where no one talked about them, but no one entirely forgot them either. Some physicians during the Black Death became extraordinarily wealthy, others died in the first month. The difference was partly luck, partly strategy, and partly whether they had figured out, through observation rather than theory, that keeping their distance from plague victims seemed to correlate with not getting plague. Physicians who visited fewer patients, who insisted on examining from across the room, who refused to touch the buboes directly, and who spent as little time as possible in sealed rooms with the sick, survived at higher rates than those who applied the conventional hands-on approach. They didn't know why. The idea that disease could pass directly from person to person through physical contact was understood hazily and partially. People noticed that plague patients' relatives got plague, that nurses who cared for the sick got sick, but the mechanism was invisible and the theory was all wrong. What wealthy plague physicians built was a practice of semi-intuitive social distancing based on pattern recognition, not science. They charged accordingly. House calls to wealthy families during peak plague years cost sums that would have been extraordinary even in peacetime. The market for reassurance was bottomless, and the supply of reassurers was rapidly shrinking. The economics of medical practice during the Black Death were, by the standards of any other time, extraordinary. Physicians who survived the first wave of the epidemic found themselves in possession of something more valuable than they had ever expected their training to produce. They were alive, and almost everyone who might compete with them was dead. The number of trained physicians in Europe dropped catastrophically during the Black Death, not only because physicians died in large numbers from attending plague patients, but because the institutions that trained physicians, the universities, the medical schools, the networks of apprenticeship were themselves disrupted by the crisis. A physician who made it through 1348 in a major Italian city had, in effect, watched most of his colleagues disappear and now faced a patient population that was desperate, frightened, and willing to pay whatever he asked. The wealthy were the primary beneficiaries of this willingness to pay, because they were the ones who could actually afford what was being asked. A house call from a surviving physician in Florence in the years immediately after the first plague wave cost sums that would have been considered extortionate before the crisis. But extortion requires an alternative, and there was none. Either you paid the physician's new rate or you managed without one, and managing without a physician, in a world where plague recurrences were already being observed and everyone was terrified, felt like a risk that only the completely destitute could afford to take. The wealthy paid. The physicians accumulated. Several of the most prominent medical figures of the late 14th century built personal fortunes during and after the Black Death that dwarfed what they would have earned in any normal practice lifetime. The physicians who died, by contrast, tended to be the ones who approached the plague with the conscientious thoroughness that their training demanded. The doctor who spent hours at the bedside, the one who insisted on examining the buboes by touch, as the textbook suggested, because careful examination was the mark of a serious practitioner. The one who moved from patient to patient throughout the day, in the worst affected neighbourhoods, seeing as many people as possible, because that was what a physician was supposed to do. These were not bad doctors by the standards of the 14th century. They were, in many cases, the best doctors, the most committed, the most meticulous, the most faithful to the Hippocratic tradition of attending to the sick regardless of personal risk. And they died for it, in disproportionate numbers, leaving their more cautious and considerably less scrupulous colleagues to inherit the practice of medicine in a depleted and terrified world. History has a talent for this kind of irony, and the Black Death deployed it with particular relish. The Black Death did something to art that no patron or movement had done before it. It forced wealthy Europeans to look at death not as an abstract theological concept, but as an immediate personal physical reality, and to make beauty out of that looking. The dance of death, or danse macabre, emerged in the years after the first waves of plague, frescoes, woodcuts, and tapestries depicting death as a skeleton leading people of every social class, pope, king, merchant, peasant, in a procession toward the grave. These were commissioned by wealthy patrons and displayed in churches and public spaces. They were simultaneously a theological statement. Death comes for everyone. A social commentary, even your wealth won't save you. And an act of survival, of naming the thing that had been killing everyone, of giving it a face and a dance step, of making art in the ruins. The plague generation's wealthy patrons funded some of the most striking, strange, and emotionally honest art of the medieval period, precisely because they had seen things that conventional religious imagery had not prepared them to represent. Before the Black Death, death in European art was primarily a theological event. It happened to sinners and saints in illuminated manuscripts and church frescoes, and it happened with a clear moral logic. The virtuous ascended, the wicked descended, and the artwork communicated this with the visual vocabulary of a culture that believed it understood the relationship between behavior and outcome. The plague broke that visual vocabulary entirely. It killed the virtuous and the wicked with equal enthusiasm. It killed priests who were administering last rites and penitents who had just confessed, and monks who had devoted their lives to prayer. It killed children, who by any theological standard had not had time to accumulate the sin that might justify their deaths. The existing imagery of death, serene, ordered, morally legible, had nothing to say about any of this. The wealthy patrons who commissioned new art after the plague were not looking for comfort in the old images. They had lived through something those images could not contain, and they needed new ones. The danse macabre was the most significant artistic response. Originating probably in France or Germany in the mid-14th century and spreading rapidly across Europe, it depicted death as an active, dancing figure, a skeleton with energy, and even a kind of grim humour, leading representatives of every social class in a procession that no one escaped. The Pope, the Emperor, the Knight, the merchant, the peasant, the infant. Death took them all in the same dance with the same impartiality. This was not consoling imagery. It was honest imagery, and wealthy patrons paid for it in enormous quantities because it reflected something they had actually experienced. The plague had been the great leveller in a society built entirely on the premise of stratification, and the danse macabre was the art form that acknowledged this openly, in the most public spaces available. It was, in its way, the 14th century's most truthful artistic statement, and it was paid for by the people it was most directly challenging. Music shifted too, though less visibly, because music leaves fewer physical traces. The composers who survived the Black Death wrote differently in the years after it. The elaborate polyphonic music of the pre-plague period, intricate, technically demanding, architecturally optimistic, gave way in some traditions to simpler, more dirge-like forms that prioritized emotional directness over sophistication. Laments for the dead, meditations on mortality, and songs about the transience of life circulated through the courts and chapels where wealthy patrons set the cultural agenda. The wealthy patrons who funded this work were doing what human beings have always done with art when ordinary language fails. They were trying to make something that could hold what experience alone could not contain. It didn't answer the questions the plague had raised. Nothing did. But it made the not answering slightly more bearable, and in 1349 slightly more bearable was the best anyone could honestly offer. Wealthy children during the Black Death occupied a specific and somewhat poignant position. They were the most protected members of their households, and, paradoxically, among the most affected by what the protection required. Isolated in country estates, kept away from servants who might have been exposed, prohibited from playing with village children, homeschooled by tutors who were themselves nervous about proximity to anyone who coughed. Wealthy children of the plague years experienced the catastrophe as a kind of sealed, inexplicable removal from normal life. Parents who survived wrote of the difficulty of explaining to children why their playmates were gone, why the city was empty, why the church bells kept ringing, why the servants' quarters were quieter than they used to be. Some children were sent to monasteries for safety, which was not always the protection it was intended to be, as monasteries were losing clergy at devastating rates. The children who survived grew up shaped by the experience in ways that historians have traced through the generation that came of age after the plague, more pragmatic, more commercially minded, more preoccupied with legal inheritance and documentation of wealth than their parents had been, as though the lesson of watching everything disappear overnight was write it down and protect what you have. A wealthy child's experience of the plague began with the journey, the rapid departure from the city conducted with an urgency that adults were trying to conceal, and children could feel regardless. Things were packed that were not normally packed. Servants were moving faster than usual. Conversation stopped when children entered the room, which is always the thing that tells a child something serious is happening, more reliably than any explicit explanation. The trip to the country estate was described as a pleasant change of scene, an early holiday, an opportunity to enjoy the gardens and the fresh air. Children are not fooled by this kind of thing. They knew something was wrong. They just did not know what, and the not knowing had its own texture of dread that was different from, but not necessarily easier than, the dread of understanding. On the estate, the experience of wealthy children during the plague years was one of peculiar confinement, dressed in the clothes of privilege. The estate was large and comfortable and adequately provisioned. There were toys, lessons, music, the company of siblings and cousins who had also been removed from the city. But there were also walls, invisible walls made of adult anxiety, of the instructions not to go near the village, not to speak to the servants without permission, not to accept food or objects from anyone outside the immediate household. Children who broke these rules by accident were treated with a seriousness that was frightening precisely because it was disproportionate. You had spoken to the miller's son through the fence, and you did not understand why this was causing your mother to look at you the way she was looking at you. The child-sized world of the estate was safe. The full-sized world just beyond its walls was something children were not permitted to approach, and the prohibition itself communicated everything they were not being told directly. The generation that grew up during the Black Death became, by the historical evidence, a specific kind of people. They documented obsessively. They kept accounts and records and correspondence with a thoroughness that exceeded even the already considerable documentary habits of the wealthy medieval class. They were disproportionately represented among the founders of hospitals, charitable foundations, and civic institutions, people who had watched the social infrastructure of their world nearly collapse, and who were determined, in a way that had a specific 8-year-old's eye quality to it, to build things that would not disappear. They had been taught, at the most impressionable age, that everything could disappear, and so they built and recorded and documented as though the act of writing something down was itself a form of survival, which, in a world where memory was fragile and death was capricious, it very nearly was. The plague killed men and women at roughly equal rates, which meant that the Black Death produced an enormous number of wealthy widows, women who suddenly found themselves in control of substantial estates, businesses, and fortunes, often with no surviving male relatives close enough to immediately claim authority over them. Medieval law was not kind to widows in ordinary times, but the plague created situations that medieval law had not anticipated. Women managing entire estates because there was simply no one else left to do it. Women making commercial decisions, negotiating with creditors, hiring lawyers, and running households at a scale that would have been considered well outside their appropriate sphere 6 months earlier. Some of these women remarried quickly, by choice or by pressure. Others held their positions for years, carving out a pragmatic authority that the legal system would eventually try to claw back once it recovered enough to notice. The plague didn't give women rights. It gave some of them, briefly and precariously, power, and the ones who knew what to do with it changed their families' trajectories for generations. The legal position of a wealthy widow in 14th century Europe was defined by a set of rules designed to protect male property interests while providing women with the minimum economic security necessary to avoid becoming a social problem. A widow was typically entitled to dower rights, a share of her late husband's estate, usually a third that she could hold during her lifetime. She could not sell it, alienate it, or leave it to whoever she chose. It was hers to use, but not to own in any modern sense. Beyond the dower, everything passed to the male heirs, sons, brothers, male cousins in descending order of proximity. The system assumed there would be male heirs. It assumed the chain of male succession would function. The Black Death broke that assumption in thousands of households simultaneously, leaving women in possession of properties the law had not intended them to hold, managing businesses the law had not intended them to run, making decisions the law had not anticipated they would need to make. It was a legal crisis dressed up as a domestic one, and the women navigating it had no guidebook. What happened next varied enormously by city, by family, and by the particular character of the woman involved. Some wealthy widows moved quickly and shrewdly to consolidate their positions before the legal system could recover enough to challenge them. They hired lawyers, filed documents, established their claims to specific properties before competing relatives could organise a counter-argument. They made themselves legally visible in ways that women in ordinary times had little reason to be, appearing in court records, in notarial documents, in commercial contracts, creating a paper trail of authority that was difficult to subsequently deny. The women who did this successfully created positions of genuine economic power that some held for years or even decades, managing estates and businesses with a competence that the historical record documents clearly, even if the historical record was not always particularly gracious about it. Others were overwhelmed, not by incompetence but by the sheer scale of what they were suddenly required to manage, with no preparation, in the middle of a crisis, while simultaneously grieving. Some were taken advantage of by male agents and lawyers who recognised their vulnerability and positioned themselves accordingly. Some simply waited to be told what to do by whatever male authority reasserted itself most quickly, because waiting was what they had been trained for and what the world consistently rewarded them for doing. The plague had opened a door, briefly and without ceremony. Not every woman was positioned to walk through it, and many who tried found it closing before they had fully crossed the threshold. The medieval legal system was remarkably resilient. It had been knocked sideways by the worst demographic catastrophe in European history, and it still found time, once it had caught its breath, to remind widows that their authority was temporary and their autonomy conditional. Some things about the 14th century were extraordinarily modern. This was not one of them. When the plague was finally over, or rather, when it retreated into the background hum of recurring outbreaks that would continue for centuries, the wealthy survivors of Europe were left with a transformed world and a troubling question. What was money actually for? The Black Death had demonstrated with brutal clarity that wealth could not guarantee survival, could not buy a cure, could not stop the plague from crossing the estate threshold if it was determined to do so. It could improve the odds. It could purchase comfort and care and geographic distance and full pantries. But it could not purchase immunity, and it could not purchase certainty. In the years after the first waves of plague, wealthy Europeans threw money at art, at theology, at hospitals, at charitable foundations, partly out of genuine gratitude for survival, partly out of lingering terror, partly out of the dawning and deeply uncomfortable understanding that the only thing separating a wealthy man from a mass grave was luck, and a few degrees of exposure, and that perhaps wealth, having failed to save the people they'd loved, should at least be made to mean something. It was a lesson the 14th century wrote in stone and bones. History characteristically would have to learn it more than once. The pre-plague understanding of wealth among the European elite was not particularly philosophical. Money was land, and land was power, and power was the ability to make other people do what you wanted, and the accumulation of all three was both the means and the end of aristocratic existence. The wealthy did not spend much time asking what their wealth was for, because the question implied justification, and justification implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was not a posture that wealth encouraged. Wealth was its own argument. You had it because you had it, and you kept it because you could, and if God had wanted you to have less, he would have arranged for that, and the fact that he had not was itself evidence of approval. This was not a sophisticated theology. It was, however, a convenient one, and it had served the European wealthy class reasonably well for several centuries before the plague arrived and complicated it considerably. The complication was this: the plague killed rich people. Not as many rich people as poor people in absolute terms, but enough, and visibly enough, and randomly enough, that the implicit argument of wealth as divine approval broke down under the weight of counterexamples. The duke who died, the bishop who died, the merchant whose entire family was gone by Christmas. These were not people God had apparently disapproved of, or if he had, the standards of divine disapproval were so inscrutable as to be functionally indistinguishable from randomness. and randomness was a problem for a worldview that depended on divine order to justify the distribution of everything, including money. The plague made the wealthy ask a question they had never had to ask before, and the discomfort of not having a good answer drove an enormous amount of what they did next. The wealthy response was largely channeled through charitable giving, which served the simultaneously convenient and genuine purpose of making wealth mean something beyond itself. Hospitals built by plague survivors were not merely public relations exercises. They were genuine institutions that provided real, if limited, care to people who would otherwise have had none. The university medical faculties that began, in the decades after the Black Death, to actually study the disease, to observe its patterns, question the old theories and tentatively propose new frameworks, were funded by wealthy patrons whose encounter with plague had made the question of how disease actually worked feel considerably more urgent than it had before. The slow, uneven, centuries-long process by which medieval medicine began its movement towards something more functional was accelerated by the Black Death, and the acceleration was paid for by people whose wealth had not saved them, but who hoped that, redirected toward knowledge, it might eventually save someone else. That, in the end, is what the wealthy survivors of the Black Death bought with their fortunes that was actually worth buying. Not immunity, not certainty. Just, eventually, incrementally and at tremendous cost, a slightly better understanding of what they had been up against all along. Which is, when you think about it, the best that money has ever really been able to buy. Let's talk about something no history book lingers on long enough: what the 14th century smelled like, specifically what a wealthy household smelled like during the Black Death, because the answer is complicated in ways that tell you more about the era than almost anything else. The short version is that it smelled like burning herbs, expensive candles, unwashed bodies, dog, wine, and underneath all of it, faintly and persistently, death. Not the dramatic immediate smell of death that was outside, in the streets, in the mass graves being dug at the edge of the city. Inside the stone manor, behind the closed shutters and the fumigated rooms and the pomanders, held to aristocratic noses, the smell of death was subtle, a background note, present nonetheless. The wealthy were not living in a bubble of cleanliness and fragrance. They were living in a slightly better-smelling version of the same catastrophe, and the difference between their smell and everyone else's smell was, like most differences between rich and poor in the 14th century, a matter of degree rather than kind. Wealthy households burned aromatic materials constantly during the plague years. Juniper, rosemary, frankincense, camphor. These were not decorative choices. They were medical interventions prescribed by physicians who believed that strong, pleasant scents could counteract the miasma carrying the plague. The braziers that burned in wealthy rooms throughout the day and evening filled the air with a thick, resinous fog that was genuinely disorienting if you weren't used to it, and that the inhabitants had stopped noticing entirely, which is itself a telling detail about how quickly humans adapt to even the most extreme sensory environments. Visitors to well-appointed plague-era homes described the atmosphere as almost church-like, dim, smoky, smelling of incense, which was presumably somewhat intentional given that churches were the architectural model of places where divine protection was understood to reside. Beneath the aromatics, the household's own organic reality continued undeterred. People sweated. Animals, if they were kept in outbuildings rather than the main house, still made their presence known through the walls and the shared air of a medieval estate's enclosed courtyard. Food was prepared and preserved and occasionally went wrong despite everyone's best efforts. Chamber pots were emptied, but not instantly, and not without a moment of olfactory democracy that no amount of wealth could entirely prevent. Rushes on the floor absorbed spills, food scraps, and the daily passage of boots that had been through the courtyard, and they smelled accordingly. The dog slept by the fire and smelled exactly like a dog that had been sleeping by a fire, which is to say, powerfully. What the wealthy managed, through the aromatics and the hired cleaning staff and the more frequent changing of linens, was not the elimination of smell but its management, the layering of preferred scents over unavoidable ones in a ratio that favoured the former. It was, in its way, the same thing that expensive perfume does today. Not cleanliness, but the convincing performance of cleanliness, delivered through enough olfactory distraction that the underlying reality becomes a background note rather than the headline. The difference between a wealthy household and a poor one during the plague was not that one smelled good and one smelled bad. It was that one smelled like herbs and beeswax candles and expensive wine over the top of everything else, and one just smelled like everything else. Both were medieval. Both were living through the same catastrophe. One just had better top notes. And in an era when smell was understood to be the mechanism of disease transmission, better top notes felt, however incorrectly, like survival. There is a document from Florence, written sometime around 1348, describing a dinner party. A proper dinner party, multiple courses, good wine, musicians in the corner, guests in their finest clothes, conversation that was apparently both lively and genuinely funny. The host was wealthy, the guests were wealthy, and the city outside the windows was, at that particular moment, losing somewhere between 300 and 400 people a day to the Black Death. The document does not treat this juxtaposition as remarkable. It describes the food with care, notes which guests said something clever, and mentions the plague almost in passing as weather. This is either the most callous document in medieval Italian literature or one of the most human, possibly both at once. Because what the wealthy did with food during the Black Death was not merely eat, it was perform continued existence at a table in the company of others, with ceremony intact, as though the ceremony itself might hold the catastrophe at bay through the sheer force of its continuity. Feasting as a response to crisis has a very long history, long enough that it might be considered a psychological universal rather than a class behaviour. But the wealthy in the 14th century had the resources to do it properly, and properly meant something specific. Multiple courses, each prepared according to the elaborate conventions of aristocratic cookery, served by staff in appropriate dress, consumed in the correct order at the correct pace with the correct accompaniments. Medieval feast culture among the wealthy was not primarily about the food. It was about the performance of social order, the demonstration that rank, refinement, and the rituals that distinguished the wealthy from everyone else were still intact and functioning, regardless of what was happening outside. When everything else was collapsing, the dinner table was the last redoubt of normality, and the wealthy defended it with the same determination they brought to everything else they valued. The food itself during the plague years was both richer and stranger than in ordinary times. Richer, because supply disruptions had paradoxically concentrated certain luxury foods in the hands of those who could still access them: spices, preserved meats, expensive wine, while making ordinary staples more expensive and harder to source. Stranger, because medieval physicians had theories about which foods protected against plague and which made you more susceptible, and wealthy households followed these theories with the earnest compliance of people who had no better options. Onions were believed to absorb miasma from the air when left uncut in rooms, which is why medieval paintings sometimes show bowls of onions on wealthy sideboards in plague contexts. Vinegar was considered protective. Heavily spiced food was recommended because spices were understood to counteract the corruption of the humours that the plague supposedly caused. Astrologers, who were also consulted, had their own dietary recommendations that were different from the physicians' and equally unfounded. The result was tables laid with food that was simultaneously lavish and anxious, a feast constructed partly from genuine wealth and partly from fear, each dish a small act of defiance against the thing outside the windows that had no interest in being defied. The wealthy ate well because they could, and they ate ceremonially because it mattered, and they ate the onions and the vinegar and the heavily spiced meats because their physicians told them to, and because doing something felt better than doing nothing. And when the meal was over, and the musicians packed up and the guests departed for their own sealed houses through streets they tried not to look at too carefully, the table was cleared, the candles were snuffed, and everyone went to bed hoping that morning would find them still the kind of people for whom dinner parties were a reasonable response to the end of the world. Often enough, it did. And so here we are, at the end of a very long, very strange, very expensive attempt to not die. You've spent the last however many minutes inside the 14th century, inside the stone manors and the sealed country estates, the smoke-filled rooms and the perfumed letters, the dinner parties held in defiance of mass graves, and the deathbed wills signed in a handwriting that got shakier with every line. You've met the physicians who survived by doing less, the widows who built empires from grief, the children who grew up knowing that everything could disappear, and the dinner guests who ate heavily spiced food because their astrologer said it might help, and their physician said something different, and both of them were wrong, but the wine was good so nobody mentioned it. The wealthy of the 14th century did not survive the Black Death because they were better people. They survived, when they survived, because they had options. More space between themselves and the rats, more food in the cellar when the markets closed, more roads they could take when the city became unlivable, more people whose job it was to stand between them and the worst of what the world was doing. None of it was a guarantee. None of it was even close to a guarantee. Kings lost daughters. Merchants lost everyone. The plague did not negotiate, did not recognise titles, and did not care even slightly how much your estate was worth. But here is the thing that stays with you, after all of it. Through the burning herbs and the wrong theories and the bloodletting and the prayers offered to saints who were also, statistically, dying, through all of it, people kept going. The wealthy kept their dinner tables set. The poor kept their fires banked through the night. The physicians kept making house calls into rooms that terrified them. The widows kept signing documents. The children kept asking questions that nobody had good answers to. Humanity, in the 14th century, was stubborn in the way that humanity has always been stubborn. Not because it had a plan, but because stopping felt worse than continuing, and so it continued. They did not know what the plague was. They did not know what caused it, how it spread, or how to stop it. They were working in total darkness with tools that were mostly decorative, praying to a theology that the plague had shaken, and making decisions about survival based on pattern recognition and intuition, and the particular, very human instinct that doing something is better than doing nothing, even when the something is wrong. And somehow enough of them made it through. Enough of them banked the fire, sealed the gate, opened a vein for the physician because at least it was an action, ate the heavily spiced food because the recipe came from someone who seemed confident. Enough of them survived that we are here, centuries later, in beds that are warm and clean, and not made of straw, in houses with walls that seal, in a world where we know, finally, mercifully, 500 years too late, that it was the fleas. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable, well-heated, thoroughly non-medieval situation you have arranged for yourself, maybe spare a quiet thought for the people of 1347. Not just the wealthy ones with their herbs and their physicians and their country estates, all of them. The ones who had options and the ones who had none. The ones who made it and the ones who didn't. They lived through something we cannot fully imagine, with tools we would not recognise as adequate, in a world that gave them almost no protection and expected them to carry on regardless. They carried on regardless. Sleep well, you've earned it. They definitely did.